Hi, I'm Scott Giles, and thank you for being my patron. Well, I'm almost 72 years old now. Some people tell me I don't look my age, and that's always fun to hear. And when people say that, I usually jokingly remark something along the lines of, well, yeah, but I got this portrait in my attic that I don't like to look at too often. Some of you will have chuckled at that because you recognize the allusion to the 1890 novel, The Portrait of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. In that story, the protagonist, Dorian Gray, never seemed to age himself, but he had this painting of himself that he hid away that always reflected all the diseases, lifestyle choices, and general debauchery with which he lived. Well, I don't make that joke too often these days, not because it's stopped being funny, but because education in the United States these days increasingly resembles trade schools, and people tend not to know about classical literature. And if you don't recognize the story of Dorian Gray, the joke falls flat. And these days, I'm sorry to say, very few younger people recognize that literary reference. But in any case, I am determined to age well. That's a big deal for me because I never expected to live as long as I have. I was told not to expect to live much beyond 40. You see, there's a syndrome that affects all the men in my bloodline, and we tend to develop overlapping medical problems as we age. I am older than my father was when he died, and I have the syndrome worse than he did. I am now the only remaining male member of my bloodline alive. But I'm still at it. Fortunately, there have been medical advances, and they worked for me, and I've taken care of myself physically in a way that the other men in my family typically did not do. So I've had to cognitively reimagine myself as my life has gone on, and it's become increasingly obvious that I'm probably not going to drop dead anytime soon. So, how does an old guy think about himself as he gets older? For me, I've settled on a passage from the epic poem The Leaves of Grass by the 19th century American literary genius Walt Whitman. He wrote, I announce a life that shall be copious, vehement, spiritual, bold. I announce an end that shall lightly and joyfully meet its transition. I announce myriads of youths, beautiful, gigantic, sweet-blooded. I announce a race of splendid and savage old men. Well, the coming of a race of splendid and savage old men. Well, let's be politically correct here and degenderize that. I announce the coming of a race of splendid and savage old people. That's it. I want to be a splendid and savage old people. So what does that mean? Well, when trying to figure out what being a splendid and savage old person could possibly be, I turn to the historical figure that I think fits that bill. Now, having been trained in ancient philosophy, my first two degrees are in philosophy, I go to that literature to get a clue. The ancient Greek philosopher Diogenes was an active guy who died in 323 before the Common Era at the age of 89, an immense old age for that historical time. While his writings have not been preserved, stories about him have, as his work was the foundation for later Greek philosophy, including Stoicism, and he was sort of a colorful character. He was something of a street performer. He slept not in a house, but in a very large jar in the marketplace, the ancient equivalent of our modern tiny house. He carried a lamp around with him in the daylight, claiming to be in search for a good person, which he evidently regarded as something of a rare occurrence. The story that stands out in my mind is that as he got older, his disciples asked him to please take better care of himself. They urged him to slow down, to follow a more relaxed teaching schedule, to take some time off, and so on. You know, the sort of thing we routinely tell senior citizens today. His response, however, was to say, "What? If I were running in the stadium, a marathon, ought I to slacken my pace when approaching the goal?" In other words, he liked the life he was living and could see no reason to slow down. Walt Whitman would have loved him, a splendid and savage old person. Well, these days, science tells us that one of the major things a person can do to keep themselves functional as they age is to stay active. And I don't mean playing golf and doing crosswords. I had a recent conversation with my neurologist, and we agreed that the science on this is clear. If you want to experience age-related cognitive decline, retire. That will maximize the chance of you deteriorating. Now, that's a bit strong. What the science actually says is that living what you consider a meaningful life is protective against age-related cognitive decline. It's fine to retire, provided you don't just descend into a life of lazy amusements. You need to stay involved with things you believe in. Well, I try to do that. I hope to end my life when the time comes as a splendid and savage old person. May you too. Thanks for your time and attention. I'll be back next week with another talk on a different subject. You're invited. And until then, have a great week.